guess the thing is with people of that kind of age group is that yes, they're vulnerable, but they've been through an awful lot to get to that age, so they tend to be rather optimistic and as positive as possible. Well, I guess the hard bit for them is that they're not able to see their families and their loved ones, and you know, they might need a shoulder to cry on, or someone just to keep them entertained, or just to talk to them, you know. That's a 24-hour job if you're living in there, but that's the sort of thing my little sister Kathleen does, you know. She's just one of those people that always puts everyone else first and deserves recognition for it.
Well, David, if your sister's attitude is anything as positive as yours, I'm sure she's spreading some much-needed cheer there in their home. Thank you very much, David Kim. Australians are being warned to expect the toughest year of their lives as new cases of the coronavirus increase rapidly there. Strict lockdown measures are in place after vast crowds defied social distancing regulations by flocking to pubs and beaches, which are now closed. This week, more Australian states began closing their borders to other parts of the country. From Sydney, Phil Mercer reports.
Three women fight over toilet paper at a supermarket in Sydney. It's a symptom of a country gripped by fear as the coronavirus threat intensifies.
For many, young and old, 2020 will be the toughest year of our lives.
Like watching a horror movie on TV, except it doesn't finish in 90 minutes. It just goes on.
I'm a bit worried about if England closes off their borders. I'm a bit worried about not being able to go home. And I feel like at this point in time, I just want to be around my family.
Tonight, Centrelink overwhelmed by a country in crisis. Thousands queue for support as the shutdown begins.
Welfare offices have been swamped as much of Australia grinds to a halt. In Canberra, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison has tried to reassure an anxious nation.
To those who have lost their jobs already and will, to those whose incomes are collapsing, to those who are barely holding their businesses together or have already seen their dream taken from them by this virus. This is devastating and it is heartbreaking. And we will do all we can in this place as a parliament and all we can as a government to help see you through.
There is so much misinformation at the moment, which is creating panic.
Why won't the government do more in its messaging and policies to ensure that people are practicing strict social distancing?
The government's response to this worsening crisis has come under immense scrutiny.
Shouldn't anyone with symptoms be able to get a test kit right now? There are many homeless people across Australia. I'm one of them. How do we self-isolate? If we go into a lockdown, I'm happy to be home.
How does one afford to comply with self-isolation if their financial situation simply doesn't allow for it?
In Sydney, the Reverend Bill Cruz, a well-known social activist, is critical of Australia's state and federal governments.
I despair that a lot of our leadership is as anxious as society itself, so that instead of displaying a strength, a lot of them are displaying a kind of an anxiety like the people who are panicking. And what's needed at this time are strong people who stand up and say, look, we will overcome this, there will be an end to this, let's just work it through step by step. And let's do that. We mightn't agree with who we're working with, but in a sense, all of that will come right and we'll work together through it all.
Have you recently been overseas or in contact with someone with coronavirus? It's important to monitor your health.
Public health campaigns are urging Australians to be extra vigilant. Their country is now a fortress. Borders have been closed to foreign travellers. Others are trying desperately to leave the country.
That was the BBC's Phil Mercer in Sydney. And if you're unsure how to comply with any measures such as social distancing or self-isolating, the BBC News website has lots of information
in good shape.
With more than 100,000, the U.S. now leads the world in reported infections, and New York remains the worst hit city. Mayor Bill de Blasio says health workers are under a lot of strain.
What a shock this is to them to go through what is basically battlefield type conditions compared to just a few weeks ago, what was a lot more normal life in their hospital.
To California now, where Governor Gavin Newsom has commuted the sentences of 21 state prisoners. NPR's Bobby Allen reports the governor's office says the clemency requests were being considered before the coronavirus outbreak.
Of the 21 California prisoners Newsom commuted, about half were convicted of murder. State officials said most of the inmates committed their offenses while they were young and have rehabilitated during decades of incarceration. One inmate was sentenced to life in prison for stabbing an elderly woman to death in the 1990s. The inmates' relief come as about a dozen California prison employees have tested positive for coronavirus. Prisoner advocates worry infections will spread to those behind bars. The 21 prisoners will now have hearings in front of the state parole board to determine when and if they are suitable for release. Bobby Allen, NPR News, San Francisco.
Civil rights leader, the Reverend Joseph Lowry, is dead. NPR's Debbie Elliott reports Lowry passed away late last night at the age of 98.
The Reverend Joseph Lowry was known as the dean of the civil rights movement. He was part of pivotal moments in the nation's history, from early civil rights struggles to the swearing in of the country's first black president. He gave this benediction at President Obama's inauguration in 2009.
And in the joy of a new beginning, we ask you to help us work with that day when black will not be asked to get back, when brown can stick around, when yellow will be mellow, when the red man can get ahead, man, and when white will embrace what is right.
Lowry was a co-founder of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and led the civil rights organization for decades. Debbie Elliott, NPR News.
And this is NPR. The Food and Drug Administration has approved a coronavirus test that can produce results in under 15 minutes. The maker of the test, Abbott Laboratories, says it won emergency clearance last night. Abbott says it uses a cartridge that fits into a device already made by the
fatality rate is relatively low. It's below 1%.
And what about the U.S.?
Well, here, the case fatality rate has been coming down as we've been able to do more testing. So, for instance, at the very beginning, when patients were getting tested, they were in that nursing home near Seattle, the case fatality rate looked really high. But now that we've done hundreds of thousands of tests, the rate has come down to somewhere around 1.5%. But we're still not close to testing nearly as many people as we need to.
Is testing the only reason that case fatality rates vary so much from country to country?
No. Sometimes those differences are because of factors that really do raise the risk of people dying if they get coronavirus. One of these factors is the age of a population. So you have older people, or they're simply more likely to die if they are infected. Another factor can be poverty or poor health status. That can make a population more vulnerable. And then there's the factor that we're worrying about a lot in the U.S. right now, especially in New York. It's what happens when a sudden surge of cases causes a peak in demand for health care. Here's what Dr. Stephen Lawrence had to say about why that can cause more patients to die.
During those high peaks, there may not be enough people or ICU beds or ventilators to be able to provide the critical care that is needed for all of the people who would require it.
So, John, that's why there's all this talk about flattening the curve, slowing down the spread of the virus, so that hospitals don't get overwhelmed.
Exactly. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll know whether we're succeeding.
NPR's John Hamilton, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
There's a heavy economic cost to slowing the spread of the coronavirus. Businesses are shut. More than 3.25 million people just joined the ranks of the unemployed. Tens of millions more are hunkered down. Public health experts call for patience. As the economic pains begin to mount, there are voices calling for a middle ground between lockdown and just letting the virus run its course. Your chief economic correspondent, Scott Horsley, joins us now. Scott, thanks for being with us.
Good morning.
Some staggering unemployment numbers in the U.S. What do they tell us?
Yeah, there's no question the economy is taking a big hit. The next few months are likely to show the sharpest slowdown in the U.S. economy that we've ever experienced. And this is a result of deliberate choices we're making. So it's not surprising some people are asking, is it worth it? Are these strict public health measures we've adopted more costly than the coronavirus itself?
And how are the economists with whom you've been speaking answering that question?
Well, we're in what Anthony Fauci has called uncharted waters here, but everyone is looking for some navigational buoys. I talked yesterday with MIT economist Emil Werner. He and a couple of colleagues looked back at the 1918 flu pandemic. That's obviously not a perfect parallel with our situation, but there are some similarities. Back then, there was no vaccine for the flu and no built-in immunity, just like with the coronavirus. And Werner says a lot of cities in the U.S. adopted policies like the ones we're seeing today.
We were able to dig up a bunch of old newspaper articles, and sometimes we were kind of going to ourselves, is that about today or about 100 years ago?
Back then, they were shuttering schools and theaters. They outlawed public gatherings. Werner says some cities, like Omaha and Spokane, were more aggressive than others, like Boston and Pittsburgh. So it gives us kind of a natural experiment to see how that played out.
What did they find?
Not surprisingly, the cities that acted quickly and forcefully to enforce what we would now call social distancing measures had fewer deaths from the flu. What's striking, though, Werner says, is they also perform better economically. And that's because the pandemic itself takes a toll on the economy. People don't shop and spend the way they would otherwise in a raging pandemic. And a serious outbreak, like what we saw in 1918, leaves long-lasting economic scars.
There doesn't appear to be a trade-off between saving lives and supporting the economy. If anything, the data suggests that these cities that intervene more aggressively actually did better in terms of their economy in the year after the pandemic.
Now, Werner says the most aggressive cities left their social distancing policies in place for 100 days or more.
Well, I have to ask, so are we all staying home, keeping socially distant for, I don't know, another 85 days?
Not necessarily. I talked to another economist this week, the Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer. He thinks there could be a middle path here. Right now, we're telling virtually everyone who doesn't have an essential job to just stay home. If instead you could target that message just to the people who are infectious, you could still slow the spread of the pandemic while also leaving most of the economy open for business. Now, this would obviously require a massive increase in our ability to test people for the coronavirus. You'd have to test everyone, and they'd have to keep getting tested every couple of weeks. But Robert believes if we made a serious effort, this is something that could be ramped up in the next month or two.
If you ask why we're stuck with such horrible choices,